Again, welcome back to discuss last part of topic Bread Falls. This is Chef Imraj Patel working at AISSMS College of Hotel Management and Catering Technology. In second part of this topic, we discussed various chef faults. Example of that one is split or burst crust. Flavor faults. Example is flat or poor flavor. And even we discussed texture and crumb faults. Examples are too dense or close grained, too coarse or open grained, and streaked crumb. Now we will discuss remaining texture and crumb faults. Those are poor texture and crumbly, gray crumb, and the last bread fault, that is a crust faults. Examples: too dark, too pale, too thick. Sometimes your bread becomes very crumbly and does not have a desirable texture. The reasons for that one are flour too weak. If weak flour means the flour which has a less gluten into that. Because of absence of the gluten or less quantity of the gluten, that will not help to rise the bread. Next one is too little salt. If there is no control on the growth of the yeast, it is going to grow very faster and the more gases are generated, and that also is one of the reason of the crumbliness. Fermentation time too long or too short. If it is if the fermentation is not done properly, because of the over fermentation more gases are formed, and if it is less, then less gases are formed. Your dough is not matured properly. In that case also the bread will not have a proper texture. Overproofed. So once the dough is made and kept for the proofing, if you keep for more than required time, then in that case also the more gases would be formed, and which is not required. The last reason is baking temperature too low. If you keep the if the oven is not preheated, or if it is the temperature is too low, in that case the bread takes more time for the baking and it dries out and the crumb becomes crumbly. Gray crumb. Sometimes your breadcrumbs is little gray in color. The reason is fermentation time or the temperature too high. If the bread is over fermented and the temperature is too high, because of that also the color of the crumb will change. So here in the picture you can see it's not really white. So next type is a crust false. Sometimes the crust of the bread becomes too dark. The reasons for that one are too much sugar or milk is used. So the sugar which is used in the recipe when you bake the bread, that caramelizes and that gives the color to your bread. But if it is used in a excess quantity, that will turn dark. And even the milk also has a sugar into that. If the more milk is used, that sugar which is contained already in the milk and the proteins, they will start burning. Next reason is under fermented dough. In case of the under fermented dough means for the yeast, when you keep the dough for fermentation, the yeast eats the sugar also. But if the dough is not kept for enough time for fermentation, in that case the sugar is not consumed properly, so that remaining sugar when you bake will become brown very fast. Oven temperature too high. If the temperature is too high, like generally we may bake the bread at 200 degrees Celsius or 220 degrees Celsius. Instead of that, if you keep at say 250 or 300 degrees Celsius, because of the high temperature also, that sugar will immediately caramelize and will become dark. Next reason is baking time too long. Of course, if you keep the bread for a long time in the oven, of course it is going to become brown, then dark, and after some time it will burn also. So you should not over bake the bread. Last reason is insufficient steam at beginning of the baking. If there is enough steam in the oven which will help to melt the dissolve the sugar, and the sugar will not caramelize very fast. But if there is less steam, then immediately your sugar is going to convert into the caramel, and which will make your bread brown. Sometimes the bread does not have a desirable color, it is very pale. So the reasons are very opposite to the previous was very slide, that is too dark color. So the paleness of the bread are because of if the too little sugar or milk is added in the recipe, so that if your bread does not have a sugar or very less sugar in that case, so in that case also the bread becomes pale. Over fermented dough. In the over fermented dough, all the sugar is consumed by the yeast, and there is no sugar left in the dough to caramelize. Overproofing, same like a fermentation. Once the bread is made, and if you keep that for extra time, there would not be enough sugar left to caramelize. Oven temperature too low. So to make the bread brown, the temperature plays a very important role. So to caramelize the bread, it needs a proper temperature. Baking time too short. If you do not bake the bread for enough time, so before the sugar is caramelized, before that only if you remove, of course, then your bread will not be brown in color. Too much steam in the oven. Opposite to that one, if the too much steam is there in the oven, which will keep your bread moist for a longer time, and it will resist the sugar to convert into the caramel. Sometimes the crust of the bread becomes very thick. The reasons are too little sugar or fat is used, is not enough brown, then we keep that in the oven for the longer time, and because of that the thick crust is formed. Improper fermentation, less gases are formed inside, that will also make the crust thick. Baked too long or at a wrong temperature, if you bake that one at the low temperature for the long time, then naturally the crust is going to become more thick. Too little steam, if there is not enough steam in the oven, the crust dries out very fast, and from the top that crust will start becoming more thicker. Blisters on crust. Blisters means you see bubbles in the bread or under the top layer. So that happens because of the too much liquid. If the too much liquid is used in the recipe, then while baking that liquid is going to convert into the steam and the blisters will form inside the bread. Improper fermentation. So if the fermentation is not uniformly done in the dough, then wherever there is a more yeast, where the more gases will formed and more air pockets would be there. And the last one is improper shaping of bread. So when you give a shape also, the places wherever the uh, gases are not removed properly, the punch down is not done properly, there that blisters will form. For making this video, following textbooks are used: Professional Baking, Theory of Bakery and the Confectionery, and the pictures are taken from the Google search. Now you must have understood the mistakes which we do while making breads. All the best for making fault-free and beautiful breads.